Okay, so what I want to try to do is understand what is this thing called psak, right? What is halachic decision making? Because I don't want to just go through random issues this year. We'll go through different halachic issues, different contemporary issues, but I want to understand what drives poskim to make decisions in different ways. What drives them? What are the factors? Why is it that with the same sources, different poskim will come to different conclusions? Because I want you to become somewhat more of an insider in the halachic process. Okay? Okay, so if you took the sources that I put over here, so last year I put this together, and I think this is helpful. Hold this with you for the year, or I can send you a copy. But basically, this is my executive summary in one paper of the halachic process. Okay, so if I asked you, when a posek approaches a halachic issue, so what are the factors that they take into account when they make a halachic decision? Now you can look at this, but this is so that you have it and don't have to copy from a board. But what do you think? Right? Let's talk about it. What factors? What do they look at to figure out what the halacha should be? Yeah. So the similar things in what text? No, this is important. I'm pushing you. This is not. I'm asking. This is not like a attack question. You're right. They look at similar questions, but where? Good. So one place that they look is at previous authorities. Previous authorities. Okay? That's one way. I'll call that precedent. Okay? That's what I put up here. Precedent. The one factor that people take into account is precedent, meaning, in this or in similar cases, how have particular authorities ruled on this issue? And that is one of the factors that they take into account when they are issuing a halachic decision. Okay? What else? Good. They look at, right, the Torah, by which you mean what? Right. Chumash, what else? Right. Navi, Ketuvim, Mishnah, Gemara, right? Meaning, besides for looking what previous authorities have said, what they look at, what I'll call canonical sources, right? The sources that are, right, by canonical in this sense, being part of the canon, what I mean is primary, right? Sources to which all the other authorities have to answer in order to justify their position. A posek wants to independently analyze those sources to generate a halachic position. Okay? And what's the third thing that they take into account? Yeah, what people are already doing, what we call custom. Right? What do people do? Right? Those, if I had to reduce most of the complexity of halacha, it's to those three things. Right? They look at the canonical sources, right? The Torah, the Mishnah, the Navi, whatever, and they say, how independently would I understand this halachic issue? Oh, there's a baby here. Hello. Okay. So again, right? The three factors in whose baby is this, by the way?
You could. Baby that you wrote about? Did we do something to it? I thought this was your kid. I also thought it was your kid.
Okay, I see we gained a few people here, so I'll recap and then I'll get names afterwards. Okay, so we were talking about the three factors of psak, right? The three factors that poskim take into account when they're making a halachic decision. The first is their independent interpretation of canonical sources. They look at the Torah, the Mishnah, the Gemara, whatever it might be, and they say, okay, if it was up to me to understand these sources in a vacuum, how would I understand them? Point one. Point two, is they say, okay, besides for me, it's not just me in this world. I have to take into account what previous authorities have said. So what have previous authorities said on this or similar issues? And the third issue is custom. How do people actually practice? What have they been doing? So, that sounds very simple, except it's really not simple for a million reasons. Because on each of these, it's very complicated for a host of reasons. One is obviously, well, when you're reading the canonical sources, what do you think it means, right? That when you're reading the previous authorities, what do you think they mean, right? That's hard enough, right? You can always have a dispute about that issue. But it's more than that. First of all, even if we agree that these are the three factors that people take into account when they're poskening, not everyone gives the same weight to each of these factors. There are certain poskim who are precedent-heavy poskim, right? They don't try to independently analyze the source too much. What they care mostly about is what did everyone say in the past, right? Can anyone think of an example of someone who that's the way they poskin? I know it's your second week of seminary, but still, see what you know from before. You shouldn't be afraid. It's So, if you would think of a modern posek, someone like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, right, who is known just for his encyclopedic knowledge. He quotes hundreds and hundreds of sources, and he lines them up, and he poskins, theoretically. It's not really what he does, but he gives a lot of weight to precedent. Okay? Some poskim, especially Hasidish poskim, will give a lot of weight to minhag, to custom. Right? Certain types of poskim, especially poskim who are more in the Litvish world, the Yeshivish world, whatever, people like Moshe Feinstein will give a lot of weight to their own analysis and won't necessarily quote a lot of precedent. So poskim may be weighing these three factors, but the weight that they give to each of these factors is not the same. But there's more than that. So, we said, everyone agrees. First thing you have to do when you want to understand halachic issues, you have to analyze the Torah, analyze the canonical sources, right? The primary Torah sources. Okay, good. What are the primary sources? What are they? Yeah. What? Good. So you might say Torah, and you might be right? But you also might only sort of be right, because obviously the Torah is the source of everything, except it's not actually clear whether a modern posek is allowed to directly interpret the Torah not through the lens of Chazal, right? Meaning, that's an open question, right? There are poskim who will tell you, if I have an interpretation of a pasuk that doesn't directly contradict Chazal at least, then that has halachic weight. And other poskim will say, who are you? If Chazal, in the Mishnah or the Gemara, interpreted the Torah in a certain way, that has halachic weight. But you have an interpretation of a pasuk, that doesn't matter, right? Even more so with Nevi'im and Ketuvim, yeah. So, good. So here's an interesting question. Right now, if we jump to Rishonim, there are some people who will treat Rishonim as if they're canonized. You can't argue on a Rishon. Right? There are other people who will say, no. Rishonim are just interpreters of the Talmud, so they go not in the canon, but in precedent. They just count as precedent. So sometimes you get cases where certain people view things now it's not usually Rishonim, but you want a good example, an even better example of something where some people will treat it as precedent and some people will treat it as canon, right? Shulchan Aruch. Some people will say it's in Shulchan Aruch. You can't argue, right? That is accepted text. And other people will say, no, Shulchan Aruch is Rabbi Yosef Karo. He's an interpreter of the Torah who's important, but he doesn't get the final word, right? So you'll have people who will argue about whether something goes into canon or goes into precedent. Okay? So, the Torah. Sure, the Torah should be canonical primary source, but that's not so clear because it's a primary source in the sense that it's the basis of everything we do, but in practical psak, it's a bit of an open question of how much do we look at the Torah itself for guidance, not through the lens of Chazal. Some poskim think you do, some people think you don't. Okay, so what else? So almost all poskim will agree that what does go in canon? Right, what is primary that you must take into account? If you can see what I'm pointing to? Right, the Gemara. Right, the Gemara. Right, the Shas Bavli. Right, pretty much everyone will agree you must look at the Bavli to understand the halachic issue. Okay, good. What about the Yerushalmi? What? Good. Some people don't study it. The Rambam lists it as one of the texts that he uses as a primary text. Right? So there, big machloket. Is it canon or is it a Tannaitic position that we don't paskin like? Important question. Same with Tosefta, Midrash Halacha, other Tannaitic sources. How about this? What about Agadah? Non-halachic texts in the Talmud. Machloket. Right? Some people say it's in the Bavli. It's primary. Other people say yes, but it's not a halachic text. So you don't treat it as what? Very good. And some will say it depends on the Agadah. Some Agadot are fantastic, are meant to be ethical teachings, are meant to inspire. They're not written in a halachic vein. And certain Agadot are somewhere in between. Right? Kabbalah. Kabbalistic texts. What's their relevance for halacha? Some people will say, what do you mean? The Zohar is written by Rishon Bar Yochai. It's written by a Tana. It has the authority of a primary text. Other people will say, yes, it's written by Rishon Bar Yochai, but in the Mishnah, if it's a machloket Rabbi Shimon and other people, we don't paskin like Rabbi Shimon. So it may be written by a Tana, but that has no bearing on halacha. And other people will say, what do you mean? The Zohar isn't written by Rishon Bar Yochai. Right? It's a much later text. Right? And that's just the Zohar. What about things that are in later Kabbalistic texts? What status do they have? The Arizal. I don't know. Right? Other Kabbalistic texts. So, and everything I just said, right, I put in this little box. Right? I gave you this graphics. You have it all here. Right? It's over there. Right, so as I said, the first factor that everyone wants to know is what do the primary texts of Torah say? But that question is a really complicated question because you've got to figure out what goes into that, right? Do you look directly at Torah or only through the lens of Chazal? Even within Chazal, is it only the Bavli or is it also the Yerushalmi and the Midrash Halacha? If, even within the Bavli, what weight do you give to Agadic text? Does it depend on the Agadic text or not? What weight do you give to Kabbalistic texts? Right? So, even within this category of, everyone agrees that the first thing you do when you try to understand halacha is to analyze the primary text of halacha, here's all these major questions you have to tackle to figure out what weight you should give to any text or interpretation of that text. Right? And this is, right, remember, these are meta questions about which texts you have to analyze. This is before you even get to the point of analyzing those texts. Right? You've got to figure out which texts are worth analyzing. Okay? Let's move to the next area. Precedent. Okay, so as we already noted, which precedent? Rishonim? Are Rishonim precedent? Have they moved into canon and I have to care, right? And now I can't argue with Rishonim, or Rishonim just precedent? Do I give more weight to Rishonim because they're earlier? Or to Achronim because they're later and have seen the totality of the halachic system? If I want to take into account precedent, how do I do that? How might you do that? Right? When I say, yes, I care about what previous authorities say, what do I mean by that? What does that mean? Right? We agreed. Part of Psak is we care about what people have said in the past. Okay. How do I assess that? Who do I look at? Who gets into that? How do I judge it? I don't know, right? You could say, well, Rove. Majority rules. Right, that's the rule in halacha. Great. Majority. Who's majority? Majority of who? Who do you count? Everybody who's ever printed books? Everyone you happen to read? Everybody in your tradition? Which scholars are big enough to even count? What if it's a teacher and his students and they each publish a book? Do they count as one or do they count as multiple? Because in the end of the day, the students are just following their teacher's position. Do they get an independent voice when you count the numbers? All those are disputes. Right? All of those are disputes. What weight do you give to particular precedent traditions? Like, I'm Ashkenazi. Does that mean I give more weight to certain types of precedent over others? Or do we not take that into account? Does it change when you live in America or you live in Israel where everyone lives together? Does it matter? Custom. Okay? We all agree custom is important, what people do. But that means a lot of different things. Even within custom, you have to ask, okay, which customs matter in halacha? Family customs? Local, geographic customs? Ethnic customs? Ashkenazi, Sephardi? Right? Personal family customs? My personal custom? And which type of customs do we care about? Do we only care about customs that are substantiated in halachic texts, like this is a custom that follows a certain rabbinic tradition, or even bottom-up customs that people just do and we have no idea why? Right? Which type? Or what Chaim Soloveitchik refers to as minhag versus nohag. Minhagim are formal customs. Nohag is just what people do. Right? So, as I said, to get to theoretical halacha, you got three factors. But each of these factors introduces major meta questions. Right? You have to analyze the canonical sources. But you got to figure out what those sources are. Then you've got to figure out, okay, what did previous authorities say? And then you've got to figure out who are those authorities. And then you've got to figure out custom. And you've got to figure out which customs even to take into account. Local, family, personal. All those things come together. Then, once you have all of that meta, then what do you need to do? Then you need to actually analyze the text and the precedent of the customs, right? I mean, this is just figuring out what goes into that. Then you've got to analyze them. And then, what do you have to do when you have all that together? What do? What? So then you've got to get it together. But I wouldn't say that's to paskin. When you get that all together, so first of all, now you have all these, now you need to weigh. And as I said, some poskim will give more weight to their independent analysis, some will give more weight to custom, some will give more weight to previous authorities. So you have to weigh all these together with whatever weight you give them, and that generates what? So it's not psak yet. What does it generate? What I call it is the most plausible psak. Meaning, it's not necessarily the only possible position, the most plausible psak. Are we done now? Are we done now? Now we know how to paskin? No, obviously not. Because this is only the tip of the iceberg. Because let's say you got a theoretical position. Okay? Very good. You got a theoretical position. Now what do you got to do to actually paskin? Yeah, you got to apply it. Right? This is just to generate a theoretical. But now you got to apply it. So, as complicated as it was to generate a theoretical position, now we got to take theoretical positions and formulate them into actual law, which means we need to apply them. But that's not easy, because there's a lot of questions you got to ask about this. First, there's practical issues. Okay? Meaning, even if we would all agree on the standards by which halacha determined reality, it's not always easy. Okay? It's not always easy. Let me give you an example. Okay? Everyone agrees that saving life is important. And coronavirus is risking people's lives. And therefore we should just do what protects people's lives. Okay. Good. Tell me what protects people's lives.
Staying home whenever y'all need it.
Right? Is that the answer, right? People will tell you, well, on the one hand, if you stay home, you won't catch the disease. But on the other hand, right, that might lead to depression. That might lead to, right? This is, right? All the doctors are arguing about it, right? Everyone, right? The doctors and epidemiologists and the mental health professionals and the economists and, right, the politicians, they all have factors, right? This is complex, right? It's not open and shut, right? Don't let anyone tell you it's open and shut in any direction. It's just not, okay? It's just not. My mother's an epidemiologist for a very long time, right? Like, this is not the first, it's not like coronavirus and I started here, like, thinking about mental health, about public health, right? This is like, complexity of it has been driven into me since I was a little kid. So, there's just, first, the problem of just applying it to reality, which is complicated. But it's more than that. There are meta questions. So, let me give you a mashal here, right? Let's go back to coronavirus, right? Who's making the decisions about how the government is going to protect people? What? Nope. The government. The politicians make it. Right? Right? I mean, Ministry of Health is involved, but they don't make it. The coronavirus cabinet makes it. Right? The politicians make it. So let's think about the politicians in the role of posek. Right? And the Ministry of Health, let's say, is in the role of expert. Okay? Let's, for the moment. So, the posek has a similar problem to the government, which is they may not independently be qualified to assess the data necessary to apply the theoretical issue. But they need to figure out how to take the expert advice and integrate it in order to make a decision. So what options do they have at hand? So, one option of the government would be to do... Sorry, what's your name? Rue. What, Rue? Is to do what Rue suggests, which is basically the government should just give it to the Ministry of Health. Right, which is say, we're not the experts, let the Ministry of Health deal with it. That's not what they do. Right, what do? They listen to... And that's assuming everyone agreed in the Ministry of Health. Right? But that's not what they do. They listen to the Ministry of Health, and they listen to other doctors, and they listen to economists, and then they have to weigh it. So a posek has the same problem. Right? Let's take a medical question. A posek gets a question. Okay? So, common question. Should person X fast on Yom Kippur? The halacha is straightforward. Right? The halacha is straightforward. If the person's life will be at risk from fasting, they should not fast. If their life is not at risk, then they should fast. Right? The halacha is simple. The complexity of this shaila entirely lies in the realm of reality. Okay? But now, what is the rabbi to do? So he has a few options. What could he do? He could say, right? And again, I want you to understand this is a choice. You could have one posek who says, look, my job as a posek is to determine halacha. I know nothing about medicine. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn to... Pick a name of someone who came with the shaila. I don't care. Anybody out of any name, it doesn't matter. Fine. Whatever. Tammy. Fine. So Tammy comes to the rabbi, and the rabbi says, look, Tammy, here's the rule. If your life is in danger, you don't have to fast. If your life is not in danger, you got to fast. Go ask your own doctor whether your life is in danger, and whatever your doctor says, follow. Right? That's one option in front of a posek, which is to outsource the assessment of reality to the shoel, to the person asking the question, or their chosen experts.
That's the Ministry of Health, right?
Right, essentially, yes. Another option would be to say, no, my job as a posek is to see this question through from beginning to end. So, I'm going to pick my own either my own expert who I trust or my own panel of experts and take the majority, right? Right? That's a different option. One conceptualization is that the job of the posek is to provide the theory, but they're totally out of the equation when it comes to the determining of reality, and therefore, in theory, they could just tell the person asking the question, look, go find your own expert and figure out the reality for yourself. Or they could say, no, my job as posek is to determine the reality also. Right? Is to determine the reality also. And once I try to determine the reality, so then I got to figure out how I do that. Do I pick my own expert who I trust? Do I pick multiple experts? Do I try to gain expertise myself enough that I can make an assessment? Right? That's a meta question. Right? That's a meta question about psak. And this only gets complicated. In medical issues, this is hard enough. What about in political issues? For example, land for peace. Nice, right? Non-controversial issue, right? Land for peace is a two-layered machloket. The first layer was, are you allowed to give up land in Israel to protect lives? Or is this one of those things that overrides value to life? Which is already a charged halachic question. But even once you get past that, let's say you rule that to save people's lives you're allowed to give away land in Israel, then you've got to figure out what will save lives. And then you got to figure out, well, is the job of the rabbi to say, here's the theoretical, figure it out yourself? Is it to take their own position on security issues? Is it to say whatever the majority of generals say, politicians? Is it the people's lives are in danger? So here's the theoretical, and let's do a referendum, right? But you understand how complicated it is. It's very easy to say in theory, halacha is determine the theoretical psak and then apply it to reality. As if applying it to reality was so easy. But so much of the complexity can be in that, right, in that transition from theory to reality. There's meta questions here, and then there's the actual nitty-gritty of the questions, right? There's multiple layers here, right? There's how do I determine reality, meta, and then, okay, now let me determine it. Okay, are we done yet? Is that it for psak? No, that's not it at all, right? Because this all assumes that you're dealing with a regular case. With a regular case. Except there's something in halacha which makes this more complicated, and that is a principle known as psikat halacha b'shat hadchak. That halacha works differently under extenuating circumstances. Now, why does halacha work differently under extenuating circumstances? So, well, let's think about it. The first thing I think you got to understand is the following. The Ramban writes in his Akdama to the Muhammad Hashem, in his commentary on the Rif, that halacha is not like math. It's law. And what's the difference between math and legal argumentation? Right, meaning math, there's one right answer, it's 100 or 0. Right? It's right or wrong. In legal argumentation, it's always an issue of plausibility. Right? It's plausibility. We know that, right? When we talk about Supreme Court cases, right? Things that are the most ambiguous tend to be 5-4 decisions. But even the clear decisions, how often do you get a 9-0? You'll get a 7-2, you'll get a 6-3, right? The really ambiguous, you'll get a 5-4. But like even clear cases, you'll get a 7-2. Right? Law, by its definition, is an art of plausibility, not of, it's not math. So once that's the case, so I'm here going to borrow from a formulation of Rav Lichtenstein. He said, well, once that's the case, so what you first do is you generate the most plausible psak. But when you go through a sugya, when you go through a halachic issue, at the end of it, you might very rarely, you might become totally convinced that all things considered, it's 100-0. The only right answer is usur, or the only right answer is mutter. But that's not usually what's going to happen. Usually what's going to happen is you go through it and you say, I sort of see this side. I sort of see that side. So what are you going to do? In a normal circumstance, how are you going to paskin? Whatever is most plausible, right? You're going to figure out what did you think was most plausible by the end. And that's even if your answer is 51-49, right? That you could basically see it two ways. You're slightly more convinced by one side, but if there's no reason not to rule like the 51, then you'll paskin like the 51. But because halacha is by definition a game of plausibility, so then if there's counter pressure, so then halacha allows you flexibility to rely on less plausible or minority positions. Now the way Rav Lichtenstein formulates it, which I think is helpful, is that the way you should think about it is as follows. Let's say, who wants to be the posek for now? Someone want to volunteer? Ru wants to volunteer to be the posek. Good. So, okay. So you go through an issue, and when you finish it, you're almost 50-50 on it. You could see it going either way, right? You're slightly more convinced of the side that it's forbidden than it's permitted. 51-49, right? Slightly. You could basically see it, but a little bit more convinced, okay? But the person comes to you, and she's crying, and the result of the chumrah would be a tremendous loss monetarily or psychological pain or whatever, right? How likely are you in that case to be lenient?
Very much wants to logic, wants to like fact. But maybe I'd be a little more. I think I'd be sympathetic, but I would just go with facts again.
Right, but again, I'm saying the reality is that you, having gone through it, you're basically split. Right? You could see it either way. You're slightly see it. Okay, you're a hardcore here. Okay, most people, right? I know I would do this. Would say, look, I could see it both ways. All things being equal, I might have been stringent, but I see the lenient position. It's almost as plausible to me. I really could see it going both ways. So if I have a lot of pressure, I'll rule like the lenient one, right? The more pressure is placed, though, the more I might be willing to go by the less plausible position, even when my conviction is more. Right? So if it's 51-49, it might not take so much pressure for me to say, that one is equally plausible. If it's 60-40, okay, still.
Every person's crackable.
Right. But what if it's 90-10? What if I look at it and I'd be like,
90-10, no.
right? So then it would take a lot of pressure to push me, right? A lot. But I got to add a factor here, and that is that I'm just saying this as if this is what's my breaking point? How much crying can I handle as a posek? Right? But that's not what it is, because as Rav Lichtenstein pointed out, the notion that extenuating circumstances allow different psak is built into halacha itself. Right? Halacha itself says that in certain circumstances you're allowed to be lenient b'shat atchak. Meaning halacha itself builds that in. So it's not like you're breaking the law, you're taking advantage of flexibility built into the law. But since the flexibility is built into the law, not only do you have to figure out whether to you this is a 51-49, a 60-40, a 70-30, or a 90-10, what do you need to do? You also need to figure out what types of pressures count.
Exactly, because if you're going to be known as somebody who's easily swayed, then I feel like you're not true to halacha.
Good. That would be the case if halacha itself didn't build these factors in. And that's why this is complicated, because halacha itself has a list of things that halacha itself recognizes as reason to being lenient. And therefore, you have to ask the meta question, which is, what type of factors count and how you define them? So, for example, hefsid. Monetary loss in halacha is a legitimate reason to be lenient. Not in all cases, but it's a factor that halacha recognizes. Very good. Then what do you need to ask? How much loss? For who? Objective loss, $1 million, or subjective loss? Meaning, is it objective? Do we say, $1 million is a lot of money, or do we say, Jeff Bezos doesn't care about $1 million, so that's not called hefsid, right? And on the flip side, $5 is not a big loss, but the person only has $6 to their name, right? So, given, halacha recognizes monetary loss as a legitimate reason to look for leniency. Great. But then you have to ask the meta question, how do I define monetary loss? Great monetary loss. Chilul Hashem. Halacha recognizes Chilul Hashem as a reason to be either machmir or mekil, right? Stringent or lenient, right? Chilul Hashem to who? To Jews? To non-Jews? To both? What will cause a Chilul Hashem? Right? There was an interesting machlokas in Italy about whether nowadays you can shave on Chol HaMoed. The Gemara says you can't shave on Chol HaMoed because in the time of the Gemara, people mostly had beard. They weren't clean-shaven. And therefore the Gemara says if we allowed you to shave on Chol HaMoed, then what would happen is you just would forget to shave before Yom Tov. And we want to encourage you to shave and be respectful going into Yom Tov. But so poskim in the last few hundred years have asked, okay, but now that people are clean-shaven, if you shave the day before Yom Tov, right? I shaved like yesterday. I have a 5 o'clock shadow coming in, right? Which, if I was wearing a mask, it wouldn't matter, right? But if I'm behind a screen, so I'm not wearing my mask. So the poskim said, okay, we think that. So some poskim said, look, maybe nowadays this decree doesn't apply because nowadays it's the opposite. Right? If someone is clean shaven and they shave before Yom Tov, and you don't let them shave, by definition they're going to look grungy by the time the second Yom Tov comes around. Right? So it's going to be counterproductive to the very rationale of the law. Okay? In Italy, there was a machloka that went as follows. Some poskim said, you have to follow the lenient position, allow people to shave, because otherwise it's going to be Chilul Hashem, because the Christians are going to look and say, we get all dressed up and look nice for church, and the Jews, on their holidays, they look like, right? They look unkempt. It's going to be a Chilul Hashem. You have to tell people to shave. And other poskim said, no, you have to tell them not to shave, because if you tell them to shave, the Christians will say, what? Jews aren't even willing to sacrifice their, looking clean-shaven for one day because of their law? They're not even willing to sacrifice that? Right? We celebrate sacrifice, right? Jesus on the cross. And Jews aren't even willing to sacrifice their good looks for a weekend? Right? So, Chilul Hashem was the driving force to the poskim on both sides. But for some, it was driving them to be lenient, and for some, to be stringent. Right? So the exact same factor, everyone can agree that it's a meta factor to take into account, but they disagree how you should apply it. Yuara, religious presumptuousness. Certain things you're not allowed to. In certain cases, we don't want you to be stringent because it'll come across as presumptuous. But what counts as presumptuous? Right? Do we try to determine, is it the role of the rabbi to try to figure out whether you're being presumptuous or you're doing it in good faith? Right? Is this about perceived presumptuousness or actual arrogance? Which matters? Kavod Abriya, right? Human dignity. You may have heard this, that people invoke this in many hot-button issues. Right? That the Gemara itself says, Gadol kavod habriyot shedoche lo ta'aseh Shabbat Torah. Great is human dignity, that it overrides even a negative prohibition in the Torah, which according to the Bavli means dirabanan, right? Rabbinic laws which are obligatory by virtue of a biblical law. In the Yerushalmi, it seems that in certain circumstances you can actually override biblical law for human dignity. But what counts as human dignity? Right? What counts as human dignity? Right? Is it to give people honor? Is it only to avoid disgrace? What counts as disgrace? Is it socially constructed? Is it objective? in more modern tshuvot, you'll find religious Zionism. Right? If you believe in the value of the state, and to enable the state to function halachically, you need to be creative halachically and look for leniencies. Is that legitimate? Right? Do you think that the state has value such that it's legitimate to utilize the flexibility in halacha? Right? There's an interview online that you can find where Ben Gurion was interviewed about why he liked Rav Goren so much. And he says, because Rav Goren knew essentially how to be flexible in halacha. And if you look at Rav Goren himself says yes, right? The rabbis of the generation don't understand that in order for the new state, you have to recognize that halacha by its definition is flexible, and that's how we're going to make the state work. Right? Do you believe that? And what is perhaps one of the most well-known factors in halachic decision-making? The slippery slope. Right? I'm sure you know about the slippery slope. Right? Rabbis love the slippery slope. Right? Classic rabbis love the slippery slope. Right? What is the slippery slope? In a nutshell, yeah. Right. If I allow X, then it will lead to Y, Z, etc. Whatever it'll lead to. Right? That's all of rabbinic legislation, right? Okay. So how do I take that into account in Psak now? Right? If you think about how often this is invoked, right? It's invoked all the time. Right? Definitely in modern women's questions, right? Rabbis invoke it all the time, right? Whether you agree with them or not, they invoke it, right? That, in fact, much of the dispute is about whether right? You'll see, some people will say, well, it's technically permitted, but they're doing it for feminist reasons, and once you're on the feminist, right? Once you're on that track, mi yodea la'am ze yagia, right? Who knows where this will go? And other people will say, that's not your right, right? You don't have to make slippery slope arguments. Right, but it's not just in that. It's in this was invoked a lot in certain medical questions, like does halacha endorse cloning? Does halacha endorse allowing people who are doing IVF to choose the sex of their child, or is that a slippery slope to eugenics? Right, and does it depend? Right, does it depend on whether this is their first child, or maybe they already have 4 boys and they want a girl, or does it depend on what if the couple in front of you? The father has a genetic disease that runs along the Y chromosome, so he wants to have girls to protect his child medically. Is that different, right? And then that became yet another issue in CRISPR, right? You know what CRISPR is? Yeah. Okay. Good. I don't know if everyone knows, so I'll just say it. I see. Okay, not everyone knows. That's fine. CRISPR is basically the new frontier in gene editing, where basically. It's the simple and cheap way of changing people's genes. It costs like a few $100s, where we can actually just rewrite parts of the genetic code. That's essentially what it is in a lab. It's the future of gene editing. Essentially, it costs like nothing, and it's very quick. And once we've fully mastered it, we'll be able to rewrite parts of the genetic code. Right? We can already do it to an extent. So it was invoked there also, right? If you say that something is fundamentally permitted, but you're worried that it'll lead to eugenics, and we don't like the idea of eugenics, right? We don't like the idea that people will only have, will try to make their kids only smart and, tall and good-looking according to very specific, right, definitions of looks and whatever, right? So it was invoked there as well. So if we take all this together, so now we say, okay, so Ru is the posek here, right? So someone comes to Ru with a halachic shaila. So the first thing Ru does is she says, okay, first I need to analyze the canonical sources. I need to figure it out. But she needs to take a position. First she has to say, okay, well, what sources do I look at? Do I look at the Chumash and try to figure out what I think it means? Or do I only look at it through the lens of Chazal? And then she has to say, okay, well, through what lens? Do I only care about the Bavli, like many Rishonim, or do I care about the Yerushalmi also, like the Rambam? Right? Do I care about Kabbalistic texts? And if so, what weight do I give them? when I'm looking at the Gemara, do I only take into the halachic text or the agadic texts? Right? Then, once she's made that meta decision, she looks at those texts and says, okay, well, now I know what text I'm looking at. What do I think they mean? Right? That's all step one. Then she sits down and says, okay, well, what have previous authorities thought about this? So she looks at the Rishonim, and she looks at Shulchan Aruch, and she looks at the Ramah, and she looks at the Nosei Kelim and Shulchan Aruch, and she looks at modern responsive literature, and she says, okay, this is what it comes out. There are authorities who think it's permitted, there are authorities who think it's forbidden. Then she says, okay, and how do people practice? Right? And she says, well, in this community, they follow the lenient position. This one, they follow the stringent position. I'm part of this community, but the person asking me is part of a different community. Or I live in a community where both are customs. Right? Then she has all of that in front of her, and then she says, okay, on balance, taking into account the way I analyze the text, and the way that I weigh these authorities, and the way I perceive the custom, I then figure out how much weight I give to these factors. I balance all of them, and I say, okay, all things considered, I think that the most plausible answer is prohibited. I'm not totally convinced. I'm totally convinced. I don't know. These are the positions I give. Then she says, okay, well, that's my theory. Now I got to determine the reality. So now she turns to the reality and she says, oh, wow, this is a complicated medical question. So she then has to decide, okay, well, do I tell the patient, look, this is my theoretical framework, but please go find your own doctor. Ask your doctor how they would plug in their determination of this reality, and that's what you should follow. Or does she say, you know what? It's my job to see it through the end. I'm going to go ask my doctor, or I'm going to get a panel of doctors, or I'm going to do some research and read the newest articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? And I'm going to figure it out, right? So she needs to make those meta questions. And once she makes the meta questions, then she can do the research, okay? Then she looks back at the question. She says, okay, now I've got to figure out, are there extenuating circumstances in this? If there are, said, well, what are they? Is there monetary implications? Are there psychological implications? Are these factors recognized by halacha, and to what extent are they? And how much weight am I willing to give them? And how much am I willing to push the plausibility of this halachic issue? Okay? She mixes all of that in, right? Throws it all together, and then you get a practical decision, right? And that, in a nutshell, is psak, right? Now, if you look at the clock, it's taken us almost an hour, right, just to outline the types of questions that have to be asked to even get towards an answer. This gets complicated in contemporary halacha. Why do you think this is even more complicated in contemporary halacha? Very good. As if we go back to our factors, now let's go over our factors and figure out why, as complicated as this is in any question, why new questions, contemporary questions, are harder. So, contemporary questions, are they directly dealt with in the canonical sources? No. There is no place in the Gemara that talks about CRISPR, that talks about electricity, that talks about space travel, that talks about Zoom, that talks about the coronavirus. None of those exist in the Gemara, which means that this is not a question of directly analyzing canonical texts, it's a question of applying them. Electricity. How many years of precedent do you actually get on previous authorities? 150? Right? On certain, questions of, I don't know, Borer on Shabbos, so you have thousands of years of precedent. But on electricity, right, you have 100 plus years. And on some of the shilas of the coronavirus, you have 6 months of precedent of people who have been thinking about it now. Right? So, you don't have as clear original sources. You have less precedent because the shilas have been around for less time. Do you have a custom? Very rarely, because there isn't lived practice of new questions, right? How about assessing the reality? You think that gets more complicated when you deal with new questions? 100%, right? Like I said, look around at the psak both the psakim and the government in all the governments in the world trying to deal with coronavirus, right? And what do they keep saying? Right, literally, you just watch the news. What do they keep saying? Why do they go? But what do they say? What's their line every time? There's so much we don't know about this virus, right? Yes, it looks like for most people it's not serious, but for these people we're finding that even though they had no symptoms, later on they're having neurological problems, and for these people they're having heart problems. And this type of virus, we thought it was not significant, but hey, if you have right, if you have this virus, we know that 20 years later you have an elevated rate of liver cancer, and maybe coronavirus is the same thing, right? And sure, maybe it doesn't affect your lungs, but how do you know it's not affecting your, it doesn't have gastrointestinal issues, right? And constantly, the doctors are saying, we're trying to be careful because there's so much we don't know about this disease, right? And decisions are really hard when there's so much we don't know. Halacha is the same, right? Anytime you got to make decisions that demand understanding the reality, if the reality is new, if the reality is complicated, right? You think rabbis have a magic solution? You think poskim have a magic solution to this, right? To understanding these complex realities, right? If it's hard to understand, it's hard to understand. And therefore, contemporary halacha gets complicated because, as we said, it's complicated to get to a theoretical psak. But it's more complicated when the canonical sources don't weigh in directly, so it's a question of analogy and application. When there is limited precedent to rely on, right? There's no lived tradition because the new questions are new, and the assessment of the reality is impossible. And then there's all the then there's all the pressures and extenuating circumstances, which always make things complicated. Right, so contemporary halachic issues are even more complicated because, you see the halachic process in action, right? More in dynamic movement in contemporary issues more than you do in, let's say, a rehashing of a classic issue. Because a rehashing of classic issue, right? There is canonical sources and precedent and custom. But poskim are really pushed to their limits when it's a new question, so now they have to, right, really reassess the primary issues, and they have to figure out how much weight they give to those issues when the normal amount of weight they would give may not be possible. So, for example, Rav Ovadia Yosef, right, this was pointed out once by, I'm trying to remember who pointed this out, it might have been Rav Lichtenstein, might have been someone else, a Clapper pointed out to me, right, that Rav Ovadia Yosef, who's very much a precedent posek, is an excellent resource for any application of a classic shaila. Right, any classic question, he will give you every source that has been written for thousands of years, right, and he will tell you hundreds of sources on both sides, and he'll give you his psak. But when it comes to a modern question, Rav Ovadia Yosef will sometimes quote many poskim who are arguably of lesser stature than himself. Why? Because he's a precedent posek. He likes precedent. So when there isn't precedent, he scrapes the bottom of the barrel. And he'll be like quoting journals of like 25-year-old kollel guys that he, happened to find because they said something on the topic. So it's some sort of precedent. Even though Rav Ovadia was a more major posek and more people care about him than the random journal that he happened to pull up. Right? But if you're a precedent posek and there isn't precedent, you're going to struggle. Right? And if you're a posek that really cares about custom and there's no lived tradition, you're going to struggle. Right? On modern shailas, poskim who care about, right, who primarily focus on independent analysis of canonical sources, they shine. Right? Because so poskim like that, you think about a posik like Moshe Feinstein, any modern shaila, Moshe Feinstein has weighs in on, right? Whenever you think about any hot button modern issue, right, from like the last 50 years, right, unless it's really, really modern, like the last 20 years, right, Moshe weighed in because that was the way he thought. He was creative, and therefore he would apply, right? Now all of this is only to generate the halachic position. But there's still one more step. And that is, once you have the position, what do you need to do with it? What do you need to do with it? What? Well, we did that already. Now you have it. You have your psak. Now what do you got to do with it? What? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, this wasn't complicated. You got to tell people about it. You got to communicate it, right? And now a posek has choices, right? You have choices. What do? You got to figure out what are you going to do. And now you need to take into a whole different set of questions. You've got to figure out, well, who's my audience? What choices do you have? Who could your audience be? Who? What types of communities? What type of questions might determine the way you poskin? Or how, not even the content, but how you communicate the psak, right? If you're a posek, you don't need to just come up with a decision. You now have to tell people what your decision is. Good. What do you do?
To tell people or which to tell?
Well, exactly. What choices do you have to make now? If someone asked you a question, you can choose to only answer the person in front of you. You could do that, right? But let's say you are, right? Ru is the Gadol Hador. Now she has to tell. Right now she has to tell the world. Now what does she do? What choices do you have to make?
Since we live in a world that like of modernity and age of modernity, with like mass media technology, I guess to appeal to the younger, more modern generation, I'd probably not only put it in a bunch of books and stuff, but also online.
Very good. Who you poskin for matters, and one of the factors you take into account is where do you put that, right? Do you put it in a book, or do you put it online? That's a choice. You put it online, you put it on social media, right? That's a choice to say that my psak is for the modern, younger people. That's a choice you just made, right? That's a choice. What else? Language. What language do you write it in?
Depends on your audience.
Very good, but that's my point, right? So I'll give you an example that I saw recently that I thought was very telling. Has anyone bothered following at all some of the psakim coming out about coronavirus? Okay, so if you ever go online to YU Torah, you'll find that Rav Shechter has been very active in poskening for the YU community, or whoever identifies with Rav Shechter, whatever, on coronavirus. All of his tshuvot are published online, right? Which already tells you something, right? 90% of the tshuvot are written both in Hebrew and in English. But the Hebrew, and I don't know if he did this or whoever is working with him to write it down, so I don't know who made this call, but whoever made the call, this is the result of the call. Okay? Most of them, the Hebrew is written in Rashi script, right? With formal argumentation and sources, and the English just gives you the bottom line. Now that's an interesting choice to make, because what does that seem to indicate? Again, I can't get into his head. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah, he has two different audiences. And what are the audiences? Exactly, right? Is that he views himself as both a posek for the educated, maybe rabbinic, right, caste, I don't know what you want to call it, right, rabbinic class, the educated class who want to know sources, who can handle Rashi script, who can handle formal argumentation, but he also sees himself as a posek who should at least have some direct interaction with, right, with the lady who we understand is not so educated. So he, or whoever's working with him, include an English summary. But there was a few of his tshuva don't have that. So, for example, one tshuva which is only written in Hebrew is his tshuva on triage, when you need to triage ventilators. Now, it could be an accident, right? But that might also be a choice, which is that shaila is a shaila that he might believe should go through experts. That he doesn't want just out there for someone to read and think they can make a decision. Right? He wants it to be something that people have to actually talk to an educated rabbinic authority, right? And he doesn't want them to just, right, certain things. It's not a big deal, right? You get the one-line summary. You basically know what it is. You don't want someone to have a one-line summary of triaging ventilators, right? That's something that you want to force the involvement of an educated person, right? That's a choice, right? But on, let's say, shul-related low-level issues, right? Meaning things that are not of that gravity. The RCA, let's say, was essentially acting as a posek, or we had a few Teaneck people, right? The RCBC was acting as a posek for their community. All of their communal instructions, right, which are essentially psakim, are written online, disseminated in simple, easy-to-read English. Why? Because they view themselves as being the poskim directly to the whole community, educated or not. So they just put it out, bottom line, in English, right? That's a choice, right? It makes sense because that's what they're... But media, language, all these things are choices that come down to who does the posek think they're talking to, right? Who does the posek think they're talking to? And then you've got to figure out, is it an audience who you want to provide the entirety of your halachic argumentation or not? Some audiences you want to, some audiences you don't. Right? They don't want it, you don't want it. Right? They just want a bottom line. That's a choice a posek has to make. Right? Do you view yourself as educating people who are fundamentally educated? Do you view yourself as issuing decisions, or does it depend? Right? All these things affect psak. And then there's taking into account how you write. Because when you're posketing, you're not just telling people your decision, you want to persuade. If you think you are correct, and this is what people should be doing, so you want to convince them. Right? You want to convince them. Which means that you can't just write in bottom line monotone. You can't do that. Right? Think about it. If there are people who believe that the right thing to do is for shuls to close even Yom Kippur, and they know that's hard for people to do, they don't just want people to know that Rabbi X said you shouldn't daven in shul this Yom Kippur to protect people's lives. They want people to not daven in shul to protect people's lives. Right? And those two are very different things. Right? Knowing that Rav Asher Weiss thinks you should be careful is different than people being careful. So if he's a good posek, he's not just going to say it. What's he going to try to do? Say it in the right way. Say it in a way that'll convince people. Which means that a good posek needs to take into account not just what you say, but how you say it. Right? So it's not just media, it's not just language in terms of English, Hebrew, it's language in the sense of rhetoric. How do you say it? How do you communicate? Right? How much do you just present the argumentation? How much do you plead and persuade and cajole? Right? How much do you do that? That's all part of psak. Right? All of this is part of of issuing decisions. All of this goes into psak. Right? And all of these are decisions that need to be made. So, for most of this year, we will not be doing just methodology, right? But I always think it's important on the first week to introduce this, because we're going to do contemporary issues, right? We're going to do issues that, how contemporary, I don't know. We'll do some that have been around for 100 years, We'll probably do some, shilas that are coming out right now on coronavirus, to do things that are coming out, I get the new shilas, people send them to me. Rav Asher Weiss constantly keeps coming out, but we'll probably do one or two of them at least, because they're literally coming out day to day, right? But when you read a tshuva, or you learn a contemporary issue, I want you this year to become insiders in the halachic system. I don't want you to look at it and just say, oh, well, Rabbi X says this, and Rabbi Y says that, or not Rabbi, I don't care, right? Women can be poskim too, right? I'll be on the record to it. I've said it many times, right? I don't want you just to say, X says asur, B says, right, Y says mutter. I want you to understand that every decision is this, it's an art, right? Psak is an art, it's not a science, right? It's balancing all the different factors. How do you understand the sources? Which sources do you look at? which precedent do you look at? How do you gauge custom? How do you deal with when it's a contemporary issue and there's minimal sources to rely on? How do you weigh the fact that psak is not mathematics and you're only going to get plausibility? And how do you then balance the extenuating circumstances? How does that affect it? How do you assess the reality? Who do you think determines the reality? And how do you even apply that? And all the complexity. And then once you've done that, then you'll see that poskim are going to make different decisions about how they write. Because are they writing to rabbis? Are they writing to the educated? Are they trying to directly communicate with the hamonam, with the average person? Right? Are they trying to just state their position? Or are they trying to make sure their position is actually implemented? Are they trying to convince? Are they trying to right? To persuade? Right? All those things you've got to understand. And to at least pay attention when we're looking at halachic issues and not just view it as this is a localized issue and this is what they say, but to understand every halachic issue is halachic authorities weighing all of these broad questions about what they think halacha is and how it works, and then applying it to a particular case. And as I said, contemporary halacha, where it shakes people up because there's less precedent and less custom, and it's often in the moment they need to paskin, and the pressure is greater, is often where some of these factors become more evident than they would be if it was a classic issue being rehashed for the 1,000th time. Right? The issues become much more evident when you're dealing with a modern issue. Okay, and we're going to look at different issues throughout the years. I'm open to suggestions. Right, I do not determine in advance. Some people, have like their curriculum of the exact things they like teaching. I don't. I think that to get people involved in halacha and interested, I also want to hear what type of topics you want to do. I also want an opportunity to learn. So, if I did the same thing every year, I would be bored out of my mind. I don't really like reteaching things. I will reteach some things, but so I do want to hear from you what you're interested in thinking about, what you're interested in learning. So give it some thought. If there are particular issues that you want to do, let me know. Last year, the girls surprised me with some of them, so I had to learn some issues I had never thought about in my life. I had to teach about halacha in outer space. That was quite a trip. That was very strange, but it was what they wanted to do, so we spent a week on that. It was fun. So we also did classic things like electricity, and I think we did choosing the sex of the child, which I mentioned before. We did some political issues, but I'm really open to, we did some issues that come up in some social media things I think we did. But I'm really open to whatever if you have things that interest you, so think about the types of questions that you're interested in. And like I said, the goal really is to try to become insiders in the halachic system, and understand not just what they said, but where they're coming from and what moves they're making, decisions they're making about how halacha works. Okay?